This is Judaism Unbound, episode 489 Bacon and the Jews. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And since we don't really have any big announcements to make right now, we're going to do something real quick that we have not done for a while on the intro part of the show, which is to ask you to make a modest donation to Judaism Unbound. You just do that by going to judaismunbound.com/donate. Any size donation is appreciated, even a small one, but it lets us know that you're out there and that you value what we're doing. So thanks in advance for doing that. And now we'll just jump into the episode. We've had a couple of episodes recently that have touched on Jews and meat. We had an episode on his book that's about Jews and meat with John Ephron. And we had another conversation with Jordan Rosenblum about his book on pig. And we thought this would be an opportunity to unpack some of that, just to think about other implications like keeping kosher and things of that nature. So I guess, Lex, I wanted to start by asking you, I think it was you that really generated those two episodes. And like when you were thinking that we should take on the subject of meat, what were you thinking?
Well, it started with pig. It started with pork, bacon. I like Jordan Rosenblum's points about why he uses the word pig. It's an animal, it's not just a food. But it started from thinking about pork in particular when I saw his book, Forbidden. And it struck me that, that's kind of a gap. We've talked about food at a number of points, and those conversations about food have meandered into conversations about kashrut, about keeping kosher. But we haven't really had a full-on episode devoted to talking about pig, about bacon, about pork, which I do think looms large in Jewish life. I mean, we closed the episode with Jordan Rosenblum saying this, but like pig is kind of a Jewish conversation. And not that whatever you think about eating pig or not, it comes up a lot because it is seen as this paradigmatic kind of unkosher food. And so it's a good lead-in to a conversation about what makes something Jewish, right? Like for us, what makes something Jewish is not that it aligns with the text of the Torah or the Talmud or what rabbis say you should do. It's that it's something that Jews think about Jewishly. That can come up in all sorts of ways. It can mean that foods that have nothing to do with traditional Jewish texts can become coded Jewish. I talk about every Passover, the fruit slices. There's nothing Jewish about a bunch of orange and red and yellow and green little bits of sugar in half circle shapes. But like, I would argue they're a Jewish food because people channel those fruit slices as part of their Passover observance. By the way, whether they are keeping kosher for Passover or not, I think there are plenty of people who they'll eat pork products on Passover, they'll eat bread on Passover, but they really want to get those fruit slices because it is something that marks the time of the year. It's something they have a feeling of joy about, and so they build it in. And so similarly, it shows us how what it is to connect to something Jewishly is not only to sort of affirm what the Jewish past has told us we should do, but sometimes to rebel against it. And so I'm not somebody who on this front sort of actively eats forbidden foods as a way of showing I'm that kind of Jew, which our recent guests also spoke about. But I love when people do that. I think that it's great. I think that in many other respects, that is how I navigate my Jewishness. And I guess there's one exception to that, which is I've mentioned in the past, I only drink non-kosher wine because I find the reasons that make kosher wine kosher, those reasons I find xenophobic. It's basically that non-kosher wine is wine that has been handled by non-Jews and it's seen as potentially been used for idol worship, which I find to be not the posture I believe we should relate to non-Jews with, that we assume they are idolaters or potential idolaters till other ways. So
I can't think of any non-Jews that I know that are idolaters.
Yeah, well, I know some, and proudly so. And like maybe I'm an idolater. Maybe that's the other part. Like maybe my own theology is kind of idolatrous. We've talked about that before. But like my reason for that is not, I want to do the opposite of what Jewish texts say and be like a rabble rouser. It's that I have a particular sense of what Judaism could or should be, how it would be refracted through this question of relationships. And I don't mean relationships just romantically, but I'm also in one, but like relationships with non-Jews, how we interact with our surroundings. And so I consider that, and it affects the food and drink that I eat, because there are certain food and drink rules that clash with that. With bacon, look, I think that somebody could have a similar process where they look at their relationship to food. They ask, what do I want it to look like? What do I want it not to look like? And they discern that they don't want their relationship to food to revolve around not having certain forbidden meats from the Torah. That's not where I've landed, but I think it's a great place to land. And I'm like thrilled for those in our Judaism Unbound network who are there and where we can all sort of smooth with each other about this. I guess I'd love to hear, Dan, for you, like what felt most notable about those conversations? What are you sitting with in this wonderful world of bacon? And shouts to John Efron, also other kinds of meat as well.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about as you've been talking is, and I don't want to spoil a book, but it's come out a long time ago, but in the book All Other Nights by Dara Horn, it's this book about basically Passover. Well, it's a lot of things, but one thing that's happening is like Passover is happening in the South during the period of slavery. And one of the things, I don't remember exactly how this comes in, but at a certain point, there's a secret code of some kind, a shibboleth that is supposed to be used. And the riddle is, what is the opposite of meat? And only a Jew would answer milk. And that was how you knew if somebody was a Jew. A non-Jew would say, what's the opposite of meat? I don't know, like a vegetable or...
By the way, milk did not occur to me. Like, I don't know if all of our listeners jumped to milk. That didn't occur to me, but I like the joke.
It's interesting that, so what jumped to you?
I didn't have an answer straightforwardly right away. Like, I was thinking, like, where's this going to go? Like, I'm just like noticing that in myself.
That's interesting.
I think it's probably because I grew up in formative moments of my life. I was not thinking about separating meat and dairy. And I still don't, even as I've adopted other kinds of eating practices.
That's super interesting. So it's not even right to say that only a Jew would say milk. It's that only certain Jews would say milk. And a lot of Jews and probably all non-Jews or most non-Jews would not say milk. You know, they would think about it rationally and say, well, meat is an animal. So what's the opposite of an animal? A vegetable or maybe a mineral? A rock. Mm-hmm. I don't know. What's the opposite of me? Right. But the way that connects for me to what you were saying is that when I think of Jews and their relationship to, let's start with non-kosher meat like pork, one stance is to say, I don't eat that. Right. I keep kosher. I don't eat, or, I don't necessarily keep kosher, right? Because I don't eat pork, but I don't consider myself keeping kosher. But for some reason, like, I don't eat that. Number two possibility is I don't even think about that. It's not on my radar screen. Number three is like, dafka, as we say, like I specifically do eat that because I am enacting a contrarian sort of position towards the Jewish rules. And what's interesting is that third category, right, the person who eats pork dafka because it's not kosher is actually in a certain way more Jewishly engaged potentially, or not that they couldn't be other things, but if we were only looking at the question of what they eat, they would be more Jewishly engaged than the person who eats pork, but it's just because they never think about it. It's just not something on their radar. And it was making a connection.
And I'd argue also more than the person who doesn't eat pork, but it's just because, this is what my community does. I never processed that thought. It's never really occurred to me.
Yeah. And it actually struck me that it was a little bit related to conversations that we've had about Jews in Israel over the course of this podcast, right? Where we've talked about the Jews who a lot of mainstream Jewish organizations find very problematic, that they are protesting against Israel or they are anti-Zionist or whatever, but they're actually doing a very Israel-based thing, right? They're very engaged with Israel. They're not engaged with Israel in the way that they want them to be, but they're very engaged with Israel in contrast to people that are just like, I'm just kind of an American Jew. Like, I don't even think about Israel. Like, it's not my, and a lot of those organizations think that somehow that's, I don't know, I guess they're more in favor of that than the other because it's, I guess, more consistent with the position that they want there to be. But from an engagement standpoint, the people that are protesting against Israel are actually more engaged with Israel than the people that are just not that interested. I raise it partly because it's like an interesting comparison, but partly also because I think it gets to this question of like, there are certain things that on a deep level, there's something about food that is visceral, obviously, in the sense that it's in the viscera, but there's something that it's not about the mind. It's not about thinking. It's about I react to this food positively, I guess, my mouth starts to water, or negatively, I feel this sense of disgust. And I think that there are certain things in Jewish life that people have that kind of relationship with. And there are certain things that are more in the realm of the intellect or other senses that we have, but it's the ones that I think activate people on this like really deep level. Israel, for example, I think for some people, it activates something that is like love and just absolute awe. And for other people, it activates something that's more like disgust or, right? I think it's operating not necessarily at a cognitive level is what I'm trying to say. And I wonder whether there's something that we can learn from thinking about food to thinking about other issues that currently do or have in the past activated people in Jewish life to be really, really angry at one another. Like, for example, excommunicating Spinoza over God, right? I mean, God used to have that kind of sense and now seems like not to anymore, but other things do.
Yeah, God is much less important than bacon today. In the like, I'm not. That's like a little bit of a joke, but I think genuinely there are fewer people getting in shouting matches with their fellow Jews about thinking a certain thing with respect to God than eating or not eating certain foods. I can't prove that. It just feels anecdotally true. I like what you said about viscerality. I think that there are ways in which this ties to a number of conversations. I mean, I'm thinking of our conversations about circumcision, which is also in the body.
Yep.
And it's also something that we talked about how, in the Bible, it doesn't say that pigs are more treif, are more unkosher than anything else, but it has sort of become over time that it is seen as like the most unkosher, to the point that there are some people who will eat everything but not pig. I think circumcision similarly, like it doesn't say that commandment, although you could argue certain things in rabbinic law point to it being more mitzvah than other mitzvahs, more commandment than other commandments.
Or more fundamental.
And I'm alluding to the fact that like you do it even on Shabbat, even though it breaks certain Shabbat laws. Like it does seem like it's supposed to be important, but there's no text in the Bible that says explicitly like this one is the definition of what a Jew is. But
Right.
It's taken on that sensation to people. But when we had episodes about circumcision, that unit would not have worked if we didn't feature the organization Bruchim, that from my perspective, they're doing the thing that you described with like, they're an organization that helps people, that serves people who really don't want to have their Jewish experience and their child's Jewish experience cemented around circumcision. And so to me, that's like, it's not interesting or controversial that we would feature them on our show. Like we got a lot of feedback about it, more than normal and they're among our most listened to episodes ever. Cause I think it is visceral. And even for people who like don't feel strongly about being a synagogue member, don't feel strongly even about kashrut, like there are some for whom that really is like, well, my male child needs to be circumcised. And so we can, without endorsing or despising that, like whatever it might be, that's notable. We have certain key mitzvahs or key practices like that, even though they haven't actually been articulated as such in our texts. That's kind of fascinating to me. And I think it points to how like Western thinking it tries to anchor us in our minds and our intellect, like you were talking about. But that's not really where the essence of us lives. Like we've been taught that the essence of us is like in our head.
Yeah.
And it's the things we think, the things we believe. A lot of people keep kosher or don't keep kosher, and you ask them why, and it's like really hard for them to put precise words to it. It's not coming from a place of, well, my mind thinks X, Y, Z, and so therefore my body does not ingest certain foods, or therefore my body does ingest certain. Like it's often just like, I don't want to say a vibe. That sounds dismissive, but it's like you're not following your mind, not even following your heart, to go with the cliche. Like you're following just what you're pulled towards, and it's a mixture of things you think and things you do and all of that. So I think that you're onto something really cool there. I wanted to sit with that meat dairy thing though. Like I'm genuinely fascinated by like, yeah, for some people you say meat and ask them the opposite and it's dairy, and they're not wrong or right. It's just, if you have two dishes, like the moment in my life where I think I would have been most likely to say dairy in response to that question was when I was at summer camp, and every meal, my camp kept kosher. It wasn't the strictest of koshers, but like theoretically it was a kosher kitchen. And like meals were either meat or dairy. And there were like different colors. That like the blue ones were dairy and the red ones were meat. And you had tablecloths for the meat meal. And like, if you had asked me in the middle of camp as an 8th grader, what's the opposite of meat? I think I might have said dairy. But other than that, I haven't had many moments in my life where that's been inculcated into me, either by family or by organizations or whatever. And it leads to something I wanted to name, which is like, we have so many kashrutes. We have so many ways of keeping kosher in Jewish life, like way more than we actually write down. Every organization has like either a written policy about what they do for kosher or an implicit unwritten policy. And everybody seems to think that what their Jewish organization does, what their synagogue does, is like, oh, that's like, yeah, that's what most people do, right? But like, I grew up going to Sunday school, and at my Sunday school, this was like the older Sunday school, and it was nighttime on Sundays. And there was dinner while we were there. They would order Subway. At some synagogues, like the idea that you would order from Subway for the Sunday school is unthinkable. Subway is not a kosher kitchen. There's pork products in there. There's cheese with meat, like all of it. But we ordered Subway. They never ordered ham, but they ordered turkey. Like there was meat. It wasn't even, there were some places where like they'd order from a restaurant, but it would be vegetarian. That's another kind of kosher. There's other places where like they would order the ham, even at a synagogue. Like people don't realize it. There are synagogues where like they have bacon around. They just also have other things for the people who do and don't keep kosher that are in their community. I remember going to a synagogue and there was like pepperoni pizza and also cheese pizza. And I was like, okay, like that is actually serving this community. The people that are part of this community. Now we could go into if vegans, like I think there should be like a dairy-free pizza ideally. They're gluten-free. Like we could go into all that. That's just sort of consideration for community as much as kashrut. But I think it's interesting to name the meat dairy opposite thing in the context of how we all have these inculcated senses of like, what's the most common kashrut? And it tends to be whatever my family did or whatever my synagogue did.
Definitely with food rules and food practices, but I think with a lot of other practices, there tends to be a kind of thinking within Jewish communities often. And I don't know if this is just a style of thinking that also transcends to other communities, or this is a specifically Jewish mode of thinking. It's something that goes like this. Like, let's say that you're a person who eats pepperoni pizza. There's nothing that says that you have to eat pepperoni pizza, whereas the person who doesn't eat pepperoni pizza is experiencing like there's something that says like they can't eat pepperoni pizza. So as a result, like we're actually serving everybody equally if we get the cheese pizza. And part of me feels like sometimes, right, with pizza, maybe that's kind of right. But that thinking tends to start to devolve into other areas of life where it's very different. So for example, I remember in the days when I was a college student, there was kind of an idea that's often called the frommest common denominator. So frum means traditionally observant. And so there was a sense that, well, there's nothing that says that anybody has to say the Kiddush on Friday night, but Orthodox people believe that only a man should say the Kiddush. So therefore, let's always have a man say the Kiddush because that doesn't harm anybody, because women don't have to say the Kiddush and men don't have to say the Kiddush. But if you only have a man say the Kiddush, then the people who think that women aren't allowed to say the Kiddush are satisfied. And, you know, isn't that good for everybody? And when you get into a situation like that and you're like, wait a second, you know, that's not good for everybody.
Yeah, just to be clear, because that was kind of long. Like, you don't think that. You're describing the way that people talked about it.
That other people were talking. But, you know, that means that you're saying that a woman could never say the Kiddush, and that just doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel in accordance with our values. Whereas you might say that the pepperoni doesn't really have feelings. In fact, I guess the pig would be happier if nobody ate pepperoni, right? Because, like, that would actually be better for the pigs. Anyway.
It's a good question. I mean, like, I wouldn't say for sure that they are the same, but I think that it's not for sure to me that they're different, right? Like, I do think there are people who have carefully thought about their Jewish eating practices and want to be part of a Jewish organization that feels like theirs, where it would feel like if at no point in time ever this community has meat, say, which, by the way, like there's questions of vegetarian, like we've talked about how there are some communities that just make every meal vegetarian, forgetting kashrut just because that serves people who are vegetarian and those who eat meat, because people who eat meat also eat vegetables. But like, I don't know, like basically I think there are some folks where like, do they need the pepperoni pizza? No. But does it feel like a statement on their identity?
Yeah,
that
I think that's
the
right.
natural pizza that they would probably get is never available in their Jewish community? Maybe. I'm not
No,
saying it's
I
like
think
an attack. I don't want to overstate it, but
no,
it's...
but I think it is. I think it is serious in the way that you're saying. That's kind of where I was trying to go with this, and thank you for getting me there. Was basically the idea that, yeah, you don't have to eat pepperoni, but to feel like your community would never serve pepperoni says, in a way, your kind of Judaism is invalid. Now, your kind of Judaism is not a pepperoni eating Judaism. Your kind of Judaism is a Judaism that doesn't care about pepperoni. Those are different, right? It's not a command to eat pepperoni, but it's something that just isn't part of your Judaism.
Yeah.
And by privileging the other kind, they're basically saying your Judaism isn't as valid, isn't as
Maybe a better
significant.
example is like matzo ball soup on Passover. There are some groups that believe matzo ball soup on Passover is forbidden. This is like very traditional, like very Hasidic groups who, it's called gebruchts, and like wet matzah is seen as not meeting the rules. I think for some people, if you said to them, our community is going to not have matzo ball soup at any Passover observance we do ever, for people who have a deep connection to matzo ball soup, that might feel more like shade towards them than like the pepperoni stuff.
Yeah, well, that actually connects more to that idea that I think we have talked about in the past on the podcast, and I'd like to talk about it later today, like this idea of different ways of thinking about what kosher would be, including, like, there was a movement about eco-kashrut or versions of that would say it's central to whether something is kosher or not. Was it free range? Was it raised ethically? Were the workers treated ethically in the slaughterhouse or whatever? And it was often talked about that, okay, well, those we could add to the rules of kosher, but they couldn't be instead of, meaning if you were given two different kinds of meat, one of which was raised inhumanely but slaughtered according to traditional principles, and the other which was raised humanely but not slaughtered according to principles, a lot of people would say you should take the one that was slaughtered according to the principles. That sort of indicated that that other one was nice to have, as opposed to saying, well, if we had those two choices, it would be hard to decide because they're actually both central. Maybe you wouldn't be allowed to eat either of them or whatever it might be. That wasn't really how that debate was being conducted, because in some way the more traditional one was being privileged. I want to talk a little bit more, though, about why that might be. And this is where I'm thinking back to the episodes that we did on folk Judaism versus elite Judaism, and thinking about like just different ways of thinking about what Judaism is. Or when we talked to Daniel Hartman about Genesis Jews versus Exodus Jews, right? Genesis Jews being ones who think of Judaism as primarily a family, because Genesis is a story of a family, and Exodus Jews being those primarily focus on Judaism as a set of ideas, because that's what happens in Exodus when the Torah is given. And I'm thinking now about visceral Judaism versus cognitive Judaism. And visceral Judaism, it's hard for me to know this from firsthand experience, right? Because I didn't convert to Judaism. But I sort of imagine that visceral is much more likely to be true of someone who was born into something or grew up in something. Because when you're a child, a lot of habits are formed. And I think a lot of things that you later find disgusting are also formed in childhood. And I think that if something is operating at that level of my heart opens to it naturally, or my sense of disgust is raised toward it, I'm probably looking at something that I grew up in relationship to. Whereas if you don't have those feelings, it's probably something that you came to later in life and chose as something that you like, but you don't necessarily feel disgusted by the opposite. So I think that the idea of a visceral Judaism feels to me like a kind of a closed Judaism, a Judaism that privileges those who grew up in it. And that's been something that from the beginning we've not really been for. And so part of me is like interested cognitively on this question of the relationship between Jews and meat and Jews and kashrut. But on a deep level, part of me feels like that's actually not the kind of Judaism that I'm interested in anymore. I'm interested in what I think of as a more cognitive Judaism, although I also understand the power of what you might call the visceral. I worry a lot that a kind of a more cognitive Judaism, a more Judaism of the mind, is not as kind of attractive in a lot of ways as a Judaism of the whole body. And so I want very much for Judaism to be embodied. And that's why we're excited about people like Shefa Gold, right, who bring chant into it, or other people that bring body movements, dance, meditation. And yet I wonder if there's something, ultimately we have to make a real choice between how do we feel about the parts of Judaism that seem to only have their power because people experienced them from childhood and developed really strong visceral reactions to.
So I like this frame of visceral and cognitive. I see what you're getting at with tying it to things that we just sort of do because in our bodies they feel comfortable and we grew up with it. Like I see the connection you're making, and I wouldn't deny that there are some visceral Jewish practices that I and many others connect to without logic, without a brain-driven reason. That often points to like, oh, we grew up with it. The melody, like, oh, I like this melody because I grew up with it, as opposed to some other thing. That's not like ideologically in my head, I would assert this melody for Shalom Rav is the superior one. It's like, that's what brings me a certain set of feelings. So I get what you're saying. And I like really don't want the takeaway to be like visceral Judaism is no good. I think there's lots of visceralities that are not just sort of those pieces we grew up with and didn't process in our minds. I mean, you mentioned Shefa Gold. Like, I don't even know how to define visceral well enough to really get at this right. So after the show, we should both like look at the etymology and whatever. But
viscera
like,
is another word for guts, like the intestines.
Yeah, that's the origin of it, right? But also, like, I think visceral has grown to convey there are elements of embodiment that we separate from sort of cognitive, from cerebral, whatever, that I am really, really invested in. And I think that in that unit on meditation, in that, like, we talked about embodiment, and I don't pine for like a more cognitive Judaism. I really pine for one that balances that which is visceral and that which is cognitive, that which is in our guts or body without tying to our mind, along with that which is more in our mind and doesn't call to our body. Like, sort of the give and take of those.
I think I'm trying to find a distinction between visceral, which I am tying to a like disgust reaction, versus embodied, which to me is the beyond cognitive. And I'm 100% with you. I believe an embodied Judaism is really critical. I'm raising this question about whether the visceral, what I'm thinking of the visceral, which comes from a sense of wrongness, of disgust, of right, that actually is not a Judaism that's serving us.
That's interesting. As you say that, like, it's definitely right that when people say visceral, it's usually followed by like, I have a visceral sense of horror, or a visceral, it's like negative things. I just did the Google to see what would come up. The first option for visceral is relating to the viscera. So that's where you were getting at with guts, etc. And the second one is relating to deep inward feelings rather than to the intellect. I think that's where we're hitting up against each other a little in a productive way. Like, I'm actually very grateful for this, because I'm not arguing for visceral in the sense of that which brings us an inner sense of shock or horror. I'm calling for something that ties to deep inner feelings that are not only intellectual. And I don't think you disagree with that. It's just whether that sort of is encapsulated by the word viscera or not. I wanted to bring in, I had a fascinating conversation with some friends, I think a few months ago. It might have been longer. It just sort of sat with me. But we were talking about whether, in like a menu conversation or when you're talking about food, whether fish was part of the category meat. And I had like a journey inside as this was going on, because like,
your viscera?
Look, we have yes, exactly. We have these like hot take conversations, and none of us like really is all the way invested in what we say, but we enjoy the back and forth of that. I found myself at the beginning really just like, fish is a separate thing from meat. When you go to the store, there's like the section that has fish, the section that has meat. And like, I found myself realizing that like, I, without totally recognizing it, had been shaped by a Jewish society where like fish and meat are separate categories. And I was in a conversation with a bunch of people who were not Jewish, for whom it was just kind of strange. Like, what? Because they're in water as opposed to land, it's like a different category. Lex, that's not like a particularly good argument. But we separate foods in all sorts of ways that are kind of arbitrary. I noticed this, and I noticed that look, do I think my friends were being anti-Semitic? No, I don't. Like, but like, it was really interesting how, for me, it was just like self-evident. There are Jewish rules about having fish and meat on the same plate, even though fish is not dairy. And like, did I grow up following those rules? No, not even a little. But I know, like, when I think back to the foods we had at certain things, like at our Yom Kippur breakfast, we tended to have a bunch of random fish with our bagels and whatever. And there wasn't land meat. I don't know what to say. None of us kept kosher. But like, I think my mom had grown up having certain things associated with holiday meals and whatever, and it was like fish. Maybe at one point it was the thing you were describing where like some people in the room care about not mixing fish and meat. And so that becomes the menu you sort of hold in your head and heart as tied to a holiday. And so even long after you don't have a connection to the particular rule of separating meat and fish, you look around at your table and you're like, oh, we have fish here and not meat. And so even in my mind, they become separate categories. I don't know exactly what to do with that, but I think there are ways in which Jewish foodways, even for those of us that weren't shaped thoroughly by keeping kosher in our childhoods, may be having an impact.
Yeah, it relates in an interesting way to a topic that we've talked about before too, this question of like, what category is Judaism in, or do we dream that it might be in one day? And I dream of it being in a category that is more like something that we choose in adulthood. Often when we come to something later in life, it doesn't quite sit in that same category for us. And I guess maybe it's more of a curiosity of what would be gained and what would be lost if we thought of Judaism more in that category. One thing that would be gained is that I feel like I encounter a lot of people that are converting to Judaism or have converted to Judaism or are considering converting to Judaism, and they will feel a sense of almost cultural appropriation or something like that, saying like somehow I shouldn't be doing this, like somehow this isn't for me. And I'm always like, why wouldn't it be for you? If it helps you, if it's something that is meaningful to you, of course it should be for you. And I think that their articulation is something like, but isn't this somebody else's culture? And I understand where that's coming from in our society, and I think it's valid to have those concerns. And yet I really want Judaism to be something that reassures everybody, like, no, we love having new people come. We welcome you. And somehow, because of the category that it's in, and by the way, also because a lot of Jews were born Jewish and don't think about it that deeply and do have those feelings, they sort of assume that that is inherent to what Judaism is, and they can sort of reinforce that feeling on the part of the people that are new to Judaism, that if I don't feel quite that same way, I'm somehow not quite right. And maybe I'm going too extreme on the other end in saying I wish Judaism would be something that all of us are only Jews by choice. But maybe that's painting with too broad of a brush, or maybe that's what's the expression of when you're, hitting something with a hammer that could have been done more subtly. But I think that that's part of it for me, is that I actually think that it's two profoundly different kinds of Judaism that we're trying to, mush together, and maybe they don't mix so well.
Yeah, well, the cultural appropriation piece with converts is so. I'm glad you're bringing it up. It really gets me going. Like, none of my grandparents, and I'm fairly sure none of my great grandparents, kept kosher. Since that's I'm picking one particular Jewish thing. Like, I have a rupture, we could say. Like, I have at least 100 years, and I think it could have been even more generations of time, distant from my own genealogical connection to that practice. Is it cultural appropriation for me to opt into it? No, like, it isn't. But what makes it not cultural appropriation to most people is like, well, Lex, you're Jewish, and that hasn't changed. Like you have people in your family that have been Jewish for all those generations. But like, culture is something that is done. It's not something that like lives in our DNA. Like, kashrut is not in my cells. It's not in my mitochondria. It is something that you choose to do or not do. And so cultural appropriation, like, I really get upset about this, because what it ends up doing is creating this image of a sense of really defined, closed cultural groups that don't mush together, that don't intertwine, which is totally ahistorical. And it makes a bunch of people that have only positive intentions and impact in, like, the person who wants to try out Shabbat before they've fully converted, they're not doing something malicious. Cultural appropriation is not supposed to mean, every single act where somebody from outside of a culture does something from inside of a culture, like, that's violent. That's not what this framework is. Like, if you read things about cultural appropriation, that's not what this is. It's become that to a lot of people sort of in casual conversation. But the foods we eat, the words we say, the places we go, we're all appropriate. Like, we're all doing things that don't tie to our ancestral group. And this notion that like our blood and our DNA dictates which practices we should be permitted to do without feeling like we're encroaching on others, it starts to be like blood and soil conservatism really quickly. You know, I know people are coming at it from a place that they see as progressive. I think we gotta do better on that front. But the adult versus children thing you brought up, I love when we go this direction on our show. You talked early on about Rumspringa, about how folks in Amish communities, as part of their upbringing, like consciously take, I think usually a year, but an extended period of time to be outside of the community and experience other things. Now, there's all sorts of literature about ways that's done harmfully, ways it's still kind of manipulating and pushing them to be reliant on the community of origin. Like, I'm not saying Rumspringa is a perfect thing. I do think a Jewish Rumspringa would be good. However, and not just for like Jews who grow up keeping traditional practices to have time to not keep them and see how that works. Like that, I am advocating for that. Like, I think not just Orthodox folks, by the way. Like, I think if all of us, if we grew up Reform, we had to spend a year actively not singing any of the melodies we knew, actively not using any of the translations our synagogues use. Like, we have to do Judaism in other ways. And then the Orthodox person, they can't do anything Orthodox for a year. They have to relate to it another. Like, that would build all of our muscles of connecting to Judaism outside of just our comfort zone. And it would push us towards that cognitive place of, oh, I'm actually doing XYZ holiday ritual, XYZ eating practice because I want to, not because it's just sort of where I started and I've never thought of anything else. What you and I share is we don't want people to just passively be doing anything Jewish. Like, let's take two people. One of them grows up keeping very strict kosher to the point that they don't really think about it. That it's just, that's what they eat and what they don't eat, whatever. The other person has no relationship to like food prohibitions in any sense. They eat what they feel like eating. I would like Judaism for both of those people to be something that steps in and says, hey, you know, you would benefit from trying out eating a different way. So for the person who keeps kosher, when you're a bar mitzvah, you must spend a few months like not keeping kosher and see how that goes. You might hate it and return to kosher. Like, cool. You might love it. You might find something in the middle. Like, that would be good for that person's growth and development. For the person who grew up not thinking about food at all, they should be pushed to try kosher. To me, Judaism should be doing that, but what Judaism is used to do is just sort of push people towards doing more mitzvahs, towards doing more traditional things. And when I say that, people think of like Chabad and like, hey, will you wrap this tefillin on the street? But even in Reform, conservative synagogue, even in not as traditionalist contexts, I think the goal is always to get people to do a little more tradition. Oh, you haven't done, you've done Hanukkah and Passover and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Those are your holidays. Well, have you tried Sukkot? Because you should try that one, and it'll up your amount of Judaism. And the process is not try a year where you do Sukkot, see how it lands. You should try the next year where you don't, see if you missed it, and then find what feels right for you. I do kind of want that. And with food, what stands in the way is like, people think you're transgressing God's rules, right? Like, giving a year to break God's rules doesn't sound so good. But like, those of us who don't actually see this as divinely commanded, I think we still kind of operate under the premise that it is, even though we've come to a different place. I would love us to push to actually like play around with different forms of Jewish practice. I'm sounding Sabbatean because it is a little bit. Like, I am endorsing like trying the breaking of commandments for its own sake to see if it works. And people can come at me with that if they want. But I do, in my experience, I emerge from those kinds of experiments feeling much more grounded in my relationship to Jewish history and practice. And I think our institutions are not really pushing us to do it.
Well, I think it really comes down to this question of, what do you think Judaism is here to do? Now, a lot of people, I think, have no answer to that question. They just never thought about it. They don't know. If you think that Judaism is here to convey God's rules to human beings, and you take that really literally, you know, God is a being up in the sky somewhere, you know, and has a set of rules that God wants us to do for no reason other than God wants us to do them. then you would say, well, hey, I would never tell somebody to consider stopping keeping kosher because by definition they would be breaking God's rules. I mean, why would that possibly be good? Now, if you think that Judaism is something more along the lines of over thousands of years of human existence, some really smart people who have been paying attention have noticed what tends to help people live a flourishing human life. And you should try that out because maybe it'll help you live a flourishing human life. That is rules because they're not saying, oh, we kind of think it could be this or it could be that. They're saying, no, it's this. But it's not like you're going to go to prison if you don't do it or you're, going to go to hell. It's that you just won't flourish as much. You don't believe me? Try it out, right? And that's where you say, yeah, so I actually think this would work. So try a few weeks doing it and try a few weeks not doing it and see if it's better and then decide. And I'm not concerned because honestly, if it doesn't help you flourish, I don't want you to do it. It feels like a world like that is one that's unapologetic about saying, here's what at least my version of Judaism is, and here's why. And I just want you to give it a shot. That's a very different approach than most institutions in Jewish life take most of the time. And the question is whether they are implicitly doing it because on some level they really kind of can't get, and it's maybe visceral, it's not cognitive, right? They can't get out of their viscera the sense that this is what God wants, and I don't know why, but we better not do what God doesn't want. Or they have some other notion of what Judaism is for, but I'd like to hear what it is. Now, my own experience with meat, with keeping kosher, is that I grew up keeping kosher, and I did not experience that as positive in any way, right? I mean, I didn't experience it as especially negative, but I just experienced it as like, this is what we do. And sometimes it can be kind of annoying because it means that it's harder to find a meal. But I wouldn't say I had a very strong feeling about it one way or the other. Later in life, when I stopped keeping kosher, I kind of felt the same. I felt like, it's fine.
And when you say it's harder to find a meal, because your form of keeping kosher meant that there were certain restaurants that you wouldn't eat in,
yeah,
even as other people's. I'm not saying that to
yeah.
Because people use the word and they are holding different things between the lines.
Yeah. You just had to only buy meat at a certain place or in a certain way, and that meant that maybe you had less meat in the house when you wanted to have a sandwich. I mean, it was just like, but I mean, I wouldn't say that I experienced keeping kosher as particularly oppressive. I just didn't find it to be particularly beneficial. And when I stopped keeping kosher, I didn't feel that I was missing anything, right? And so to me, that was like a good test, right? Whereas I grew up keeping Shabbat in a more traditional way, and I stopped keeping Shabbat in that more traditional way. And to be honest, I do miss something. And I'm not totally sure what to do otherwise, because like, I don't want everything but like, I think that I do live in an aspiration to figure out how to do Shabbat better in a way that would be meaningful to me, but I don't spend any time whatsoever trying to think about how keeping kosher, might be better in a traditional sense. Now, I am interested in the idea of eating based on my values, but that was not what I grew up with. That was not how kosher, now, except if our values is that we're Jewish, and this is what Jews do. But I mean, there was no sense that like we do this because it's better for the earth or it's kinder to the animals, or sometimes that was mentioned, that kosher slaughter is kinder to the animals. But if I were to find a way to keep kosher along the lines of what is often called eco-kashrut, where it would be a way of limiting what I eat to be closer to my values, I think that I would get something out of that, and it would be an innovation, meaning I wouldn't think of that as a return to something that I did in childhood. I would be thinking of that as a new thing to do, sort of inspired by ideas from the Judaism that I grew up with in childhood, but I wouldn't experience that as me starting to keep kosher again. Whereas if I went back to a version of Shabbat that was a little more limiting on the things that I did on Saturdays, I actually would experience that as more of a return to a version of what I did in childhood, because I actually think that idea of resting on Shabbat is the same concept and has real power to it. And I think that I've experienced the power of keeping kosher as largely about separating Jews from other people, which I actually don't like.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying. And in a roundabout way, as much as we had different starting points, I've said multiple times that I don't know if I keep kosher. And what I mean by that is I can say that I think kosher means a certain set of things, and other people can think that that's actually like not right. There are a set of people that I talk to about what I eat, and I say, look, I'm a vegetarian. I eat non-shellfish fish on Shabbat. I go to restaurants all the time that are not separating meat and dairy, that have pig in their kitchen. I say that to people, and like I get diametrically opposed senses of like, oh, well, you definitely do keep kosher versus, oh, you definitely don't. I haven't changed. What has changed is the reference point of whoever I'm talking to. And I think the teaching there is like, there really isn't a stable definition of what kosher is. And I'm not saying that to be some like nihilist. Genuinely, truly, go to different geographical places in the United States or around the world. Go to different communal contexts within one locality. When people say kosher, like the sentence you said, and again, I'm not saying this was wrong. Like when you said, you know, keeping kosher I experienced as sort of a hardship because it meant that we had a harder time finding a meal. Most of it was not negative, but that like for other people, they actually wouldn't get that at first. Like they wouldn't process the sentence because for them, the only thing that kosher has ever meant has been like, well, people don't eat pig products. They don't eat shellfish. They separate meat and dairy. And it's never occurred to them. They're like, oh, wait, there's people who like literally won't even go to a restaurant and order something that meets sort of the general rules because of what's in the kitchen. And neither group is wrong. But what it points to is A, there's not a stable definition of kosher. And B, that should hint at there's not a stable definition of Judaism, which is kind of the thesis statement of our entire podcast, that like Judaism evolves constantly, that we shape it when we make choices about what we want it to be. And on that front, I think we who are not stringent halakhically, we who are not traditionalist in terms of sort of trying to keep all the commandments, and that is a broad category. There are people who are ultra-Orthodox who are trying to keep all the commandments. There are people who are modern Orthodox who would say, no. The ultra-Orthodox people actually are wrong about what all the commandments are. We're more right, and so we're trying to... And conservative folks, there are folks in the conservative movement who will say, all the modern Orthodox folks, the ultra-Orthodox folks, they're wrong about what's being asked of us. But what they share is they're trying to follow all the rules. I'm not... my approach to Judaism is not trying to follow all of the historic Jewish rules. My task is not to mine the depths of Jewish history, of Jewish text, determine what God wants or what those texts wants, and then adapt my body and my heart and my mind to meet those. That's not what I'm doing. That is a fundamental difference. And this is why I say to people, I'm not a halakhic Jew. People always try to tell me, no, you do halakha, Alex, because you have like deeply thought out Jewish practices, and you like no, because look, is there part of me that would like to adapt the entire system to make kosher wine unkosher and unkosher wine kosher? There is, but I'm not really that invested in it because I don't look at all the kosher rules as like, here's my guideline, go from there. But what we haven't done on the non-traditionalist side is assert the active Jewish value and power of the Jewish practice of breaking Jewish law, if that makes it. Like when you talk about, it might have been harder to get a meal. I'm not here to say everybody needs to go out to eat all the time. There's economic considerations, there's class considerations, there's all sorts of things. I would rather be a part of a Jewish community that has programming with food in places with lots of non-Jews regularly, that goes to the bowling alley and orders the pizza there because we're doing a bowling with the synagogue event, that goes to a sandwich shop that has meat things but also has vegetarian things. Like, I think it's a preferable Jewish situation to be part of a community that is actively intertwined with its non-Jewish surroundings, including on the axis of food. It does us a disservice when the activity we do 3 times a day, eating, is forced by our rules to take place separate from organizations, restaurants, whatever, that are run by non-Jews. Like, I actively believe that a form of eating practice that is mindful about what we eat, that cares about values in the ways you described, and one of the values is we want to be deploying ourselves and our bodies in communities of other people that are not just Jews. I think that leads to a takeaway of, our community really can't do from its common denominator. Our community actually has to be willing to do events in spaces where we're going to crisscross with non-Jews. But we haven't done a good job of that on the like sort of less traditionalist side. What we've been is less traditionalist. We've said, you don't have to do the rules. Mm-hmm. We haven't said it's actually like it achieves certain values for us to live our lives in ways that don't align with some, not all, of our Jewish rules. And I think we got to do that because traditionalists will be right to criticize us as long as we don't. They'll be right to say like, okay, so you just don't want, like, what do you stand for? Like, okay, so people eat bacon, but like, if you're not giving a why to that, you've got a why of thousands of years of Jewish tradition versus like, you don't feel like it. I haven't found a good why for eating bacon, which is part of why I don't do it. And also that I don't eat meat generally. But like, we should be looking. We should be describing the whys that align with proactive values and not just sort of, we don't think we need to be that stringent.
Well, maybe we could sort of make this connection and wrap this up by thinking a little bit adjacent to keeping kosher. I was thinking a lot about Jordan Rosenblum's idea about the pig, right? That it was about the pig, not about pork, right? And that there's this weird relationship that Jews have with pigs, or almost like non-relationship that Jews have with pigs, even though there's actually nothing wrong with having a pig or touching a pig or hanging out with a pig. You just shouldn't eat a pig, in terms of kosher rules. And again, it kind of goes to one of those things of like, is there any reason you should hang out with a pig? Like, no, I mean, like, we don't have to hang out with pigs, so maybe we just shouldn't, but that sort of ends up in a situation where Jews have like a disgust reaction to just like being with a pig. And I'll tell you a story, like it might not sound like it connects, but I think it does. Like when I was a kid, so I love animals. We grew up with birds when I was a kid. We had birds. And then when I was 14, our family moved to Israel. And by the way, I was told that if we moved to Israel, I would get a dog, which I always wanted more than the bird, which, by the way, is my where I relate to Abraham, because he was also told that if he moved to Israel, he would receive a son. And that also didn't come right away. But when I was in school in Israel, in high school, I remember that we were in some like Talmud class or something like that. And the teachers tended to be ultra-Orthodox, and the students were Orthodox in the school that I went to. I mean, then there were some students like me that were just pretending to be Orthodox, but that's another story. But I remember the teacher saying something about how you can't have birdseed in your house on Passover because it's not kosher for Passover, could be confused, it's not kosher for Passover, something like that. And he said, you can't have birdseed in your house on Passover. And I said, well, what if you have a bird? Like, what's the bird supposed to eat? And the teacher's reply was, so don't have a bird.
Wow.
And I started to think like, wait, can I think of any ultra-Orthodox people that I know that have a bird? And I couldn't think of any. And then I was like, can I think of ultra-Orthodox people that have a dog or a cat?
Exactly. The pets thing.
Yeah. And I couldn't think of any. I was like, I don't think that there's a halachic, like a Jewish law prohibition against having a dog or a cat. In fact, I mean, our Jews were farmers and they had all kinds of animals around. So I think it was like I don't know exactly the sociology of it, but I think it was probably like some set of reasons why they ended up not having pets. But over time, I think it has become a kind of communal, cultural norm or an expectation that you don't have pets. Now, I actually
think... And it's a Shabbat observance. Sorry to interrupt, but like what I've heard about having dogs or cats is that in like petting them, in like brushing, if you like pet your dog on Shabbat, there's the danger that you will like, the hair will come off and you will have like you will have in a sense like broken the prohibition on like cutting. This is what I don't know if this is actually like in rabbinic texts.
Yeah, it may be, but I mean, like the reality is that we know in the past of Jewish history, Jews had a lot of animals in the house, and so
no, I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying they took that as a reason to not have pets.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I'm just saying it can't be like against Jewish law so definitively because they had animals in the house for like much of Jewish history. So what I'm saying though is that the result is that we have a whole segment of the Jewish community that doesn't have pets. Now, I actually think that is bad. Like, I don't think every human being has to have a pet, but I think that for a lot of human beings, having a pet is really important and really wonderful and special and part of life. And if you have a whole society that doesn't have pets because of a certain sort of disgust reaction that has emerged out of just a cultural situation where they didn't have pets for a long time, then you're going to end up with a situation where people don't have pets and they kind of attribute it in some weird way to religion and maybe ultimately come up with a halachic, a legal justification for why we shouldn't have pets. But the reality is that that's not the reason. And you end up with a very kind of dysfunctional reality caused by a chain reaction that wasn't ever really from a decision that for some religious or health or other kind of rational reason that we shouldn't do this. And I guess like I again I'm pointing this out because I just think it's worth considering how much of Judaism, how much of the Jewish practice that is kind of expected that people would be kind of shocked to offer a rumspringa from actually doesn't come from any reason, any rational. It just is it's happenstance. And actually, it would be better for us to find a way to stop doing it. It would actually be better to stop doing it. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that eating a pepperoni pizza is one of those things, but it might be. And how would we ever find out, right? And so that the question about like, well, maybe actually it's bad to have too many things, too many rules and regulations and expectations and visceral sensations. It's actually not good for us. What is a way to kind of curate Judaism in such a way as to actually leave behind some of the parts that are not serving us?
Yeah, not serving us gets back to the restaurant situation. I don't know, with waiters serving or whatever. So yeah, I mean, we're gonna close out. I think that's a really important note to end on. This show, this organization is agnostic about what you do with bacon. If we were having a conversation about what factory farming does and what, like, I do actually have feelings about meat consumption, and from like a Jewish axis of what should be done, this is a space where we're very happy for people to be like diehard kosher keepers in the most stringent sense, and also those who truly don't have any relationship to what goes in their mouth based on Jewish texts at all. What I do want us to do is be wherever we're at consciously. Be wherever we're at on purpose. Don't eat XYZ because you sort of happened to end up there. What I love about Judaism, and its viscerality, by the way, like the ways in which it pushes us beyond just the things that are obvious to us. I like that Judaism is preoccupied with stuff we eat. I like that Judaism is preoccupied with what we do with our hands on Friday night through Saturday, and whether those are aligned with the spirit of rest or not. We could go down the list of ways in which Judaism pushes beyond what is sort of obviously connected to our political values or our morals, to understand that it's not just about, you know, who we vote for or what we do with our money. Like, even how we deploy our bodies on a day-to-day basis does sort of filter out into how we act in the world. So I'm on board with all that. And I thoroughly agree with what you said, which is like, it can't just be that we're trying to follow more rules. I actually do follow a lot of Jewish rules, but I aspire to do so only from a place of like opt in as opposed to opt out. What I mean by that is like there are forms that you get online, and like if you're signing up for an email list, it's like 4 things are checked to start, and you have to actively choose to uncheck them so that they don't email you, right?
The default.
Like that's one thing we experience. The other is you get a form and none of the boxes are checked, and you have to actively choose which email list you're on. The way I do Judaism is the latter. I try very much not to do anything just because, well, it's a Jewish thing and I don't have a reason not to. I want us to do things from a conscious place of believing this actually serves our world. And when I try to do that, most Jewish rituals actually do meet the threshold and often exceed it. When I take on that exercise, like that's how I fall in love with a Shavuot. That's how I end up, you know, at an IHOP, where, by the way, people order bacon sometimes. Like when I did Shavuot at IHOP, like there was actually a moment where people turned to me and are like, Lex, is it okay if I order things that aren't kosher? And I was like, we're at an IHOP on Shavuot. Like we're breaking plenty of rules here. So do what you want to do. I don't think any one person can like disrupt the sanctity of a Jewish space by having something that isn't kosher. My hope for all of us is that we can just notice that meat can be a place for us to relate really actively and thoughtfully with what we put in our bodies, and sort of consider how that connects to what's in our minds and in our hearts. But we have to like do that. I hope we can come to the place of like having a proactive reason to not drink kosher wine or to actively eat certain foods, because it will serve us. It will give us the tools to articulate why unbound Judaism is not good only because we're sort of not restrained. Like unbound, it's like we're not tied up. It's also that we are deploying our unbound hands that aren't shackled in handcuffs to do things that better our world. Whether that's articulating why it would serve us more to have a Jewish world where, not everybody, but where everybody sort of encounters pets, and how that would help us build bridges and connections to all existence and not just humanity, how it might, just serve us directly, be nice to have a furry friend sometimes. Whether it's that, whether it's the positive value of eating at restaurants people call not kosher. Like, I don't even use that language. I use that because it's legible to people. So we'll close on that scattered note. We would love to hear from all of you about these episodes. Be in touch via our Facebook and Instagram at Judaism Unbound for our handles. You can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, to check out the show notes for this episode and all our others. You can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And as Dan mentioned at the top, we would be so grateful if you are open and able to support our work with a financial donation on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you all so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.